Now, we're here to talk about challenges facing the biomedical research sector, and I think it would be remiss of us if we didn't start by actually perhaps just contemplating what we've got here with this sector. And it really is the jewel in the crown of research in this country. We sort of hit above our weight in terms of Nobel Prizes for biomedical research. Globally, we contribute by some metrics almost 4% of the total biomedical research output. For every dollar we put in, by some models, we get $3 back, and that's in terms of innovation, reductions in the cost of care, and just reductions in morbidity and mortality. And medtech and pharma are amongst the fastest growing export industries. So on one level, it looks fantastic, but on another level, there has been rumblings of discontent that have been going on for quite a few years and have been amplifying recently, and that's what we're here to discuss tonight. And we're doing it with this rather wonderful panel, a very illustrious panel. Here we have people who are, let me get this right, Officers of the Order of Australia. We have somebody who has appeared on a stamp, sitting next to me. And between them, they've contributed well over 2,000 research publications. And that's worth bearing in mind because each of those research publications represents a new piece of knowledge that didn't previously exist. We're going to start by each panelist is going to spend 2 to 3 minutes with some leeway talking about what they see as major challenges. And as I introduce each panelist, I'm not going to go through the accolades because they really are just too numerous to mention. I'm just going to briefly mention some research that they've contributed to, either in an individual capacity or by running institutes or groups. So I'm going to start with Sir Gus. So Gus is emeritus, that's correct, isn't it, professor at the University of Melbourne and a principal at Foresight Associates, which is a boutique biomedical consultancy. Gus his contributions have been absolutely pivotal in the area of immunology. And for those of you, I'm sure there's many biologists in the audience, but the immune system is one of the most complex systems in the human body, only outranked perhaps by the brain. And Gus has really helped unravel 2 key things in the immune system. One is its memory, like the brain, it has a memory. So if you get hit with an infectious agent today, the next week or in 2 months' time or in several decades' time, your immune system will be ready to get that bug next time round. And the other thing that Gus has contributed to is immunotolerance, and that's the sort of reverse side. So that is how this immensely complex system can recognize foreign tissue or its own tissue, which is friendly, but also foreign tissue that is friendly. So if you're pregnant, your immune system doesn't attack your infant. And similarly, if you eat food, the proteins cross the gut and your immune system doesn't attack them. And that's obviously pivotal to our understanding of autoimmunity. And the other work is pivotal to our understanding of vaccines, which have contributed immensely to this doubling of lifespan that we've had over the last 150 years or so. So with that, if I could turn to Gus and ask you what you think the major challenges are for this sector.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How can we ensure that Australian medical research meets humanity's most pressing health needs, both nationally and globally? Key priorities must include less popular subjects such as the prevention, early diagnosis and effective treatment of mental illness at individual and community levels. Naturally, they will also highlight more obvious areas such as cancer, where my interest centres on harnessing the power of the immune system to fight this most dreaded of all diseases. Above all, we mustn't forget the health needs of the developing countries. These have much in common with those of the most disadvantaged group in our own country, in Australia itself, namely the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. In all 3 areas, finding the financial and human resources to meet the challenges will be problematic. How will we find out whether cognitive behavioural therapy is more effective than antidepressant medication in moderate depression, given that the former is so much more labour intensive? How will we appropriately trial the myriad monoclonal antibodies with anti-cancer potential in view of the enormous sums that companies currently charge for them? How will we cope with the great diversity of illnesses and deficiencies in the third world in the face of geographic, ethnic and genetic heterogeneity? Overriding all of this is the challenge of equity. How can we ensure that at least the major life-saving discoveries are accessible to the majority of citizens, or ideally to all? We do not live in a perfect world, but we should at least strive for one. Thank you.
Thank you, Gus. Thank you. So next up is Professor Anne Kelso, who's CEO of the National Health and Medical Research Council. Anne has done much seminal work also in the area of immunology, but there's also some work that happened when she was director of the WHO Collaborating Centre for Reference and Research on Influenza that I want to mention. And that centre analysed no less than 9,000 flu viruses. And they analysed this is not a big organism, okay, a virus, but they analysed the tiny bit that is responsible for sticking the virus into the inside of your nose. And they worked out how it varies between different strains, different rates of spread, different mutation rates, and different impact of the outbreaks. And of course, the reason for that, the payback to society on that is to avoid or try to avoid the next flu pandemic. And we know from the 1918 flu pandemic, we lost between 20 to 50 million people in the world, often at the peak of their productivity and their caring responsibilities. So Anne, can you tell us what your main challenges are?
Thank you very much, Rachel, and good evening, everyone. I'm going to speak as a researcher because although I'm now running a funding agency, I think of myself as still part of the research community, and I see quite a few people in the room who I recognise as active researchers at the moment. And I wanted to say that I think the big challenge for us within the biomedical research world, whether we're researchers or funders, is remembering the real purpose of why we're here. And I think this relates quite closely to Gus's comments. As researchers, I think we don't question the value of biomedical research because we know that the reason we all live, on the whole, such long and high-quality lives is to a large extent because of improvements in public health and in clinical care that have flowed directly from research, whether it's research on the mechanisms of disease or the fundamental processes of life. And I think within the research community too, we accept that it's government's role to fund research. We think it takes many, many years for a discovery to lead to some kind of product or intervention that will help improve people's health. So we see government as having a role at filling that gap between discovery and application when something might become attractive to a private investor to develop, as, for example, a new drug. And so it becomes a bit of an assumption that research is good and government should pay for it. And I think it's really important that we remember that the real purpose of the research is ultimately the improvement of human health. I think also when we write our grant applications, we make the case for why our ideas should be funded and we're really passionate advocates for our own research. But we don't necessarily step back and think, well, I'm asking for $500,000. Is this actually the best way to spend $500,000 to solve the problem that we're posing? So I think there's a very big responsibility for us as researchers and for those of us who are running funding agencies to step back from that and say, what is the really important thing here and what's the best way to fund the research that we need done as a society to address the problems we have today and the problems that we can see that we'll have in the future, whether they are the Indigenous health gap or dementia or obesity or antimicrobial resistance or the next pandemic. I think We at NHMRC, there may be people here who want to talk about this, but it may not be of interest to the more general audience. We're reforming the way we fund research at NHMRC, and as I go around talking to people about how we do that, very few people say, but what's the best way to fund research for the country? And I think it's a very big challenge to pose that question and for each of us to step back from our particular perspective. And I don't think that we yet really know how to have that conversation. So I think that's a big challenge for us. It's a huge opportunity at the moment because we're changing how we fund at NHMRC, but we also have a big new fund coming online from the federal government, the Medical Research Future Fund, which is going to double the amount of money available for medical research from the federal government over the next few years. So I think it's a really important time to step back and say, what are we here for and what's the best way to spend this money? I think it's a national conversation.
So sort of biomedical research as service, very clearly as a service to the community. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
So next up we have Professor Darren Kelly, and we're not going in order as you would have noticed, who's CEO and MD of Ocarix. Have I pronounced that correctly?
Yeah, Ocarix.
Okay, which is a biopharma company that produces or is working on compounds that can treat eye diseases caused by inflammation and scarring. And Darren is also Associate Dean, Innovation and Commercialisation in the Medical Faculty at the University of Melbourne. Now, over a decade ago, I believe you were still a lab-based researcher at that point, Darren discovered a compound that slows scarring of the kidneys and the heart in people with diabetes. And that led to a spin-out company called Fibrotech Pharma, which was eventually acquired by a global pharmaceutical company called Squire for a record sum for what was at that stage a very, very early stage intervention. So I guess the payback to the community here is both in terms of commercialisation dollar values, but also as development continues, we may end up with a spanking new treatment for one aspect of diabetes. So Darren, can you tell us what you see as your main challenge?
Yep, thanks, Rachel. Yeah, I thought I'd start off talking a bit about the past 12 months and some of the positive things, particularly around funding research gaps, which we've noted before. Things like the Biotech Translational Fund, which is going to leverage investments for venture capital, for companies like the Medical Research Commercialisation Fund, so that we can commercialise later stage assets in Australia and keep them here and build our knowledge economy locally and also employ people locally. So that's a really important aspect of a funding gap being bridged. The Medical Research Future Fund, as Anne was mentioning before, also aims to bridge the gap around innovative translational research and also projects such as BioCurate, so the collaboration between Melbourne University and Monash University aims to fund that very early stage of innovative research and curate those projects into pharmaceutical products. So, three really very positive aspects of bridging those funding gaps. So the issue I see at the moment is human capital, and it sort of follows on from what Gus was saying, human resources. And I think it's a really great opportunity in Australia to bridge some of those gaps in the human resources, particularly linking industry and academic skill sets and building enterprise into our current programs. I think, there's a major opportunity there. So we can work on our capital, our people, and changing our culture. We can do this by building alternate careers for PhD students, scientists, clinicians, and changing the way PhD programs work, offering students the opportunity to do enterprise if they'd like to, and starting to broaden the skill set so that these students then have a different option when they graduate. Also, early to mid-stage career options could be industry academic fellowships, internships, and even potentially career sabbaticals. So, for example, CSL's already has its centenary fellowships, which attempt to bridge this gap for clinician scientists. So these are some of the things that I think we need to positively embrace. And I don't think that should impact, if someone takes a step out of academia into industry or vice versa, I don't think that should impact their NHMRC application if they decide to go back into academia. It should be enhancing their career opportunities.
So Darren, you're seeing the potential of a golden age of biomedical research. but we've got to get the people pipeline bit
exactly
fixed.
I think that's really
Lovely.
critical.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Sarah Meachem is next up. Sarah is a testicular biologist at the Hudson Institute of Medical Research. Her research includes the discovery that FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, which is a hormone that it was best known for stimulating the helping production of eggs, is actually essential for sperm production as well and maturation. And that obviously has real social impact if you consider the recent finding that we've seen. I think it was a 50% drop in sperm counts over a 40-year period in Australia, New Zealand, North America and Europe. So Sarah, what do you see as the main challenges?
I think one of the biggest, thanks Rachel, and good to see you all. I think one of the biggest challenges facing biomedical research today is maintaining our, what you call our world-class biomedical research workforce. And I guess I just sort of wanted a show of hands. Who actually is a researcher in the audience? Okay, so a significant amount. So I guess I'm really talking to the researcher, you, the workers and the innovators. And as a sort of a natural extension of maintaining our world-class workforce, I think it's really important that planning well the workforce into the future, so Australia and the world can continue to reap the exceptional returns that health and medical research really has brought to Australia, not just and the world, not just advances in health, but also enormous economic and social returns that really Australians have enjoyed, over the last 50 or 60 years. There is no doubt that biomedical research, the biomedical research sector has been a major contributor to the prosperity of this country. So then what's the problem? What am I actually talking about? Well, we aren't maintaining our workforce at this point in time. And I'm just talking about, I want to keep it really simple because I've only got 2 minutes. I'm just talking about size. It's really that simple. You out in the audience have seen it every day. You see people leaving, you see corridors that are quieter, and in addition to that, you're seeing certainly lab doors being shut. And you have certainly felt it as well. 1 in 7, 1 in 8 grants now, at least in terms of project grants at the NHMRC, are getting up. It's very, and it's highly competitive at a it's so competitive, it's the most historically, I guess, competitive, Anne, I would say. In addition to that, we know that 25% of you are very uncertain as to whether you will actually have employment next year. And that brings about a whole issue around morale of the sector as well. But what does actually this all mean? What am I talking about? Where am I going with this? Well, there has been a 15% decline in the number of full-time equivalent biomedical researchers over the last 3 years. That's a really big drop. And it's a really big drop of lost and obviously human capital. And, this human capital, as you know, you guys are highly talented, skilled experts essentially leaving active research. And at least in the short term, these people that we're losing are essentially irreplaceable. You guys not only are PhD qualified, but you have got decades of experience as well. So it's a huge loss, I believe, to the health and medical research community. So, and I think it's really important to also state that the people that are leaving are not actually don't want to leave. They are actually being pushed out. Now, I don't want to get depressed about this issue, but I think we need to be very clear about what the issue is, so therefore we can understand it and then we can resolve it and solve it. So what's the cause of this decrease in the health and medical research workforce sector? Well, let's just take information that we know from the NHMRC, the peak funding body. We know in the last 6 years there has been the same bucket of money that's dipped into for grants. So that's $800 million a year, and over the last 6 years there has been no change in that amount of funding there. And in addition to that, the confounding issue is the cost of science and research is increasing. So it's sort of a no-brainer, if you like, that we're in this funding predicament, that something has to give. And I guess it's the job, it's the researcher, it's the personnel. And now, as Anne's already explained, the NHMRC, led by Anne, has had to work to minimise the impact of this funding predicament. And obviously, in part, that was why, I guess, there was a review of the granting funding scheme. And I will say, I mean, it's been a heroic, what the NHMRC and the sector have been doing. And just to finish off though, but I guess my question is, what's the tipping point here? How many more researchers can we lose before the sector actually really does crumbling down? We have already lost at least 15% of our workforce. We know that there is certainly decreased career opportunities for researchers, and we know there's increased job insecurity. And I guess with the most vulnerable of the sector are our early and mid-career researchers. And just in closing, but the national narrative is innovation, innovation and innovation. But people innovate. So let's look after you, the innovators. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm hearing that it's a morale issue, a big morale issue here. Yeah. Last but not least, Professor John Carroll, who's Director of the Monash Biomedicine Discovery Institute. John works on egg production, and in particular why we get this high level of chromosomal abnormalities in older women. So if you're over 40, about half your eggs are going to have funky numbers in chromosomes, which is not good. And society is pushing all of us to reproduce later. So if you want to reproduce, the chances are you're going to have to, you may well face this issue. John's team's recent work has been delving into the process of meiosis, which is when in early development the egg splits and you get the number of chromosomes are divided in half because we have a pair of each one. And in particular, looking at a protein called securin, which is part of this this molecular machine that helps move the chromosomes apart, and this seems to decrease with age. So there is a potential, and it's only a potential at this stage, that you could manipulate the levels of that. Is it protein, is it, securin? It is indeed, yeah. And boost healthy egg production in older women. So can you tell us your major challenges?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to make a plea here for beautiful science, and what I mean by that is the importance of fundamental discovery research in the pipeline to the great, the Fibrotechs and the companies that are being generated in Australia, the new drugs that are being developed in Australia. I think we've got a fantastic model in Australia where investigators are really tuned in to commercialisation. They're tuned into the clinical imperatives that are really facing Australians and the rest of humanity. And the recent discoveries that have led to advances in treatment of cancer that we heard Gus mention earlier, with regard to the immune system being able to be harnessed to tackle cancers. The new treatments in treating cardiovascular disease and in treating diabetes, all of these new exciting therapies that are just coming through are all based on many years of discovery research. And I think what we're finding is that industry is really starting to pick up on this. They're starting to understand that, look, as pharmaceutical industries or industry or other industries in the medical sector, we can't fund all of this R&D research ourselves. But look out there in the community, there is many years of NHMRC and ARC funded research that is really primed for really development and commercialisation. So I think it's a real imperative. I think there is the pendulum, if you like, is switching, has moved a long way towards the rhetoric around translation and clinical health delivery, and there's not enough conversation about what role discovery research plays in that pipeline to the development of new drugs. It's discovery research that's really going to lead to the big unexpected findings that are going to lead to the innovations that drive new and unexpected medical treatments in the future. So I think we've got a major challenge in the future in terms of ensuring that we really maintain that strong fundamental discovery research base in Australia, but connect it, and I think it is well connected at the moment, through to the clinical environment and partnering with industry in order to create that next generation of medicines. And I think that's really what I see as a major challenge at the moment is bringing a bit more focus back into the critical importance of the early phase discovery, so that pipeline of discoveries in 10, 15 years is still really healthy and strong.
So long-termism and a sort of public appreciation of the discovery.
Yeah. I think we are all aware that the world is becoming a very short-term place. I mean, whatever you read on the internet is today's truth and tomorrow's nonsense. But in terms of developing the truth and developing discoveries, it's one of those areas where it's what is totally inspiring to the young scientist. To those young scientists out there who've come across their first major discovery, and that discovery is you're the only person in the world who knows that at this particular moment in time, it's an absolutely fantastic feeling. It's something I only wish I could remember more frequently. But it lives on with my students and my postdocs. But it's one of those things that that really does drive and inspire the next generation of scientists onto making the great discoveries and developing those onto application.
Lovely, thanks, John. Darren, can I just ask that when you made your discovery that has since been commercialised, did you have a long-term view then, or were you really a happy scientist playing in your sandpit and wow, you came across this?
It's a good question. So at that particular time I had an NHMRC fellowship and a program grant, and I was just looking to do something that had more impact on society and human health really, and it was opportunistic that I started collaborating with a group of chemists, and I think that was one of the key things, collaboration. I had a biology background, the other group with Spencer Williams had a chemistry background, and together we could actually do something useful. And so, do I have a long-term plan? Well, if you had have asked me that when I was 25 or 26, it was probably be an NHMRC fellow and be another NHMRC fellow, and that plan changed along the way.
Okay, thank you. So we have a microphone there. Where's the other one? I can't see where the other one's gone now. Oh, lovely, okay. But before we start, what I'd like to do is to get the audience to perhaps ask questions, but also feel free to offer solutions. But also I'd like to find out, we know that I think about maybe a third or a half were researchers. Could I ask who is a member of the general public? And so you will be a supporter of biomedical research through your taxes. You may have participated in clinical trials. You may have donated data or bodily fluids, for which the sector is eternally grateful, actually. But who would consider themselves a member of the general public here? Can I say we'd really love to hear your opinions as well. We really would like to hear what you think and what you see as the problems from the outside, because you will have a different view that will be very, very valuable. So who would like to be the first person to come up and either offer an opinion or ask a question? Please come up.
Good evening, and thanks for the opportunity to ask my question here. My name is Rob Akers from the Australian Synchrotron. Just wanted to pick up on what you were talking about, Darren, about the gap between academics and industry. What do you see as one of the major challenges, or what are the major challenges in fostering more engagement between industry and academia? Delighted to hear what the rest of the panel here thinks as well. Thank you.
Yep, that's a really good question. I think in Australia we're fantastic at innovation. So we invent things, we adopt them, and that's innovation. What we haven't done so well is the enterprise part, and turning that invention into a product, whether it's a commercial product or a product that has social outcomes. And so I think building up that skill set in the enterprise part of the journey is really important. and goes back to some of the other points before around back to the fundamental research. Picking people that do innovation is around picking people often, and it's people that are collaborative, people that are conscientious, and people that are persistent. And if you've got those three characters, you've got a great set of assets to be innovative. And in many ways, you need that time to be able to create. So it's a really good point. And you know, our product pipeline will be built that way.
I'd just like to follow on with, I think, as you mentioned earlier, that the environment in Australia is really positive in respect to the venture capital funding that's come online recently and BioCurate. All of these are really positive developments that have taken place. But it's more about what opportunities there are to really build that industry in Australia rather than offshore, isn't it? I think that there's a real challenge there that we face, because the biotech industry in Australia is relatively small compared to big markets like the US and elsewhere. So it'd be interesting to know from your experience, is that a...
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, exactly what you're saying. We've filled some of the gaps in terms of later stage development and that middle valley of death, the early clinical trials. But it's like you say, that early phase of getting projects out of research labs and into that developmental phase, which I think we need to concentrate on a lot more now.
Yes, I think, speaking from a funder point of view and somebody who's worked in research institutes, I think that there's a dilemma for many researchers who have positions working as an academic in a university or maybe as a researcher in a medical research institute or in a hospital, that they feel as if they have to choose between doing academic research and doing innovative industry-related research, because the measures of success in those two systems are somewhat different. I think there's a really important role for us at NHMRC as an agency to help the assessors of our grants appreciate what a semi-industrial career looks like, and to put a proper value on people who work in the academic sector but are patenting discoveries, working with companies to develop those discoveries, maybe stepping up for a while to be a chief scientist in a startup company, that sort of thing. And so that's something that we're working on at NHMRC.
And do the new granting structure, does that address it directly? Does it?
It's more peer review processes that apply across everything we do in the old and the new grant structure. And so we've started already with trying to provide guidance to assessors to take into account people's industry experience. But it's just the first round of that, and we're looking for feedback on how effective it's been.
Can I ask what may be a really stupid question? Why do you have to provide guidance? Why can't you just tell them? Is that...
I think it's because there are many researchers who don't have that experience themselves, and so they don't know how to assess the value. They don't know necessarily, some do, but many don't know a lot about the patenting process, don't know about the enormous effort that goes into developing intellectual property, protecting it, making it, getting the types of data you need to make it attractive to a VC or to a big pharma. It's a different type of work, and it's hard to value if you haven't experienced it yourself. Thank you.
And I think that universities and research institutes are doing a lot better at that now. In the last, the landscape's changed completely, hasn't it, in the last five years or so, in terms of universities understanding how industry, what industry needs and how they work, and likewise their relationship with us. And I think one thing we've found really, really helpful, and I can see him sitting in the audience over here, is having a few individuals in the research environment who have had that experience, have been out into industry, have made careers in industry, and then come back into the research environment. They have struggled with funding from any source, with regard to getting back into the system. But once in and being able to help all of the help and connect up the research to the industry partners has been really exciting and accelerated things quite a lot. I think.
Sarah and Gus, do you want to add anything or? Okay. Then we've had somebody waiting very patiently over there. Could you tell us who you are and then?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Amy Shepherd. I'm a PhD student at the Florey Institute with the University of Melbourne. And there's been a lot of talk from the panel about mixing academia with industry, which is really great, but that's when you're at the stage of drug development. What about basic science? When we're talking about, we don't know how the brain works, we don't know how the immune system works, and there seems to be, when you write a grant, or at least this is my perception, you have to say, this is relevant to this disease. I'm going to find a drug for this. But how can you find a drug for something you don't understand? How can we fund basic science, which is going to fundamentally help all of these health issues more?
Could be for me.
I think that might be for you.
I think it's a really good question, and I think some comfort should be drawn from the fact that we're still spending about 35 or 40% of the NHMRC budget on basic research. So that is where most of it's going. And I think, while I completely take your point that these are really fundamental processes that we still don't understand, and research into them is absolutely critical, and that's what we need to have the discoveries for the longer term that are going to lead to new interventions. But I think it can also be helpful to step back from that and think, well, why is this important? At a bigger level, how can I articulate the value of my research? I may not be able to say that this will produce a drug for that disease, but I can articulate the significance of my research in a bigger picture. And I think it's very valuable to be able to do that. And I agree with you that, of course, one can't always predict where it's going to lead, and that's very important that we fund that sort of research.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to?
I wouldn't mind a quick follow-up. Yeah, look, I think you're right. You're right in line with what I was trying to talk about earlier on. And I think if you're in the granting system, and the number of times you've written a beautiful grant on trying to understand a fundamental process, that is critical in order to get to a point where you can start to understand what sort of neuronal circuits you might want to interfere with and what drugs you might need to use to do that. It's I think that the number of times you get questions from the panel or from the reviewers and from around there's no demonstration of pipeline to the clinic. There's why aren't you doing work on human patients here? And this is for a 3-year project grant trying to understand how a neuronal circuit works. I think that's part of the problem here, but this is not a problem from the NHMRC's perspective. This is a problem from our perspective, because it's scientists who are writing those reports. It's the research community that is making the critiques of the research. And I think being clear about the importance of understanding fundamental mechanisms that will, you would anticipate lead to opportunities for new drug development is really important. And I think that's something that is really missing in the environment at the moment, or it's the real challenge in the environment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Actually, if I could add something here, I also think that what's missing from the narrative is a discussion of the cultural impact of new knowledge. And where you see this happening extraordinarily well is outside of the biomedical sector in astronomy. And astronomy isn't much used for much, but it's very well funded, and that's because. Partly because astronomers are very brave about talking about the sort of cultural value of their work, and they spend a lot of time talking to the public, and they monitor it. They measure how many public hour contacts they've had per year, so they take it very seriously. So there is a way of having that narrative working for you, and really giving something back to society. So it's not just saying, give me money and I'll do discovery research. It's saying, give me money, I'll do discovery research, and I will share it with you. Do you want more comments, or should we have another opinion?
I'm Stella Monson. I'm a reproductive biologist from the Hudson Institute, reaching obviously the end of my career. And I believe we're in a real crisis, as Sarah said, with supporting our young and particularly our middle-level scientists. In my team, I may have to close my lab next year after 30 years of really groundbreaking research that's been sufficient to enable me to be a Fellow of the Academy of Sciences. And this is not because we don't do good research, it's just because there's not the funding there. Now, we apply all over the world, including NHMRC, obviously. I think we have to be, in Australia, really putting our minds to how we can obtain more funding for these middle-level people who've already undergone 15, 20 years of training. They are really smart people and they're leaving in droves because they're not funded. So I'd like us to consider how we might perhaps coerce or encourage a lot more donation into medical research from from wealthy individuals who we know are in Australia and don't give a lot away. Perhaps other industry. We also find it very hard to get stuff from the lab into industry, although we have a lot of really substantial developments ripe for commercialisation. Very hard to get a partner for this. So I think we have to be looking beyond our immediate funding and trying to work to bring more money into the system, because without that, we won't have a research community in another 10 years.
Thank you. That's extraordinarily sobering. Does that talk to the whole idea of sort of public trust in the system and whether we're doing enough to bring the public along and hence bring government along? Because trust is sort of earned, it's not just a given. So are we doing enough, and what would a better system look like? Anybody want to jump in there?
Well, I think I've got three things to say. I think probably the first thing, and the immediate problem that I guess Lois was sharing was I think that we definitely need, in order to stabilise what we have right now, which is really what Lois was talking about, it sounds really boring, but we actually need further investment. Okay, and I actually believe, in the organisations that I have been working with, we believe that there needs to be a substantial increase in the medical research endowment account of the NHMRC in order to stabilise that. But in addition to that, I also think that we need a predictable, sustainable funding model for Australia, and maybe not just for Australia, maybe for the region, maybe for the Asia Pacific region. Something like the Framework 7, I think it's now the Framework 8, over in Europe, where all the different countries come together and put in their little bit of money, which actually amounts to an enormous amount. So there's even another tier or another layer. But I think a very long-term sustainable funding model is required in Australia. This will maintain what we've got in terms of our world-class research. It will maintain and ensure that we continue to have those great advances in health as well. And in short, I guess.
But if we're going to seek more philanthropy, that's going to require more public trust. And so how are we going to go about doing that? Like, what would that look like?
I think, Anne and probably everybody on the panel will probably, I think you cannot underestimate the public and as consumer advocates. Certainly in over the last numerous years, I've pounded the pavement at Parliament House and spoken to, all levels, the highest levels of government. But what's really critical in those really successful meetings is actually to have somebody come from the public with somebody from their heartfelt story. And I think bringing the public with us is really important, and that's certainly something that we haven't done well in the biomedical research sector. I don't know if Anne?
I'd certainly agree with what Sarah has said, and I think it's great to talk to MPs. Politicians want to hear what the general public thinks, and I think politicians are very interested in understanding how they can help improve the health of the community. I think that we have bipartisan support for the new Medical Research Future Fund, and that's very precious because that's potentially a lot of new money into the system. And I think that it's probably productive to praise governments, whichever of whichever flavour they are, for looking after that fund and for spending it wisely, because we want to encourage them to maintain that fund, to make it grow and to use it well. So sometimes it's a good idea to praise governments rather than to damn them. You might get more support from them in the longer term. So that's a general comment about the Medical Research Future Fund. But I think we live in a really interesting time because of the internet and social media and the way we now have access to information from all sorts of different sources, where we can't always individually assess the quality of that information, and so we're very prone to being persuaded by people we trust, people we know, people's personal experiences. And it means we have a funny contrast that's very obvious today. Maybe it was always there, but it's so obvious today that we have a whole world of people who are really interested in science, and I guess that includes everybody who's come along tonight, and people who want to get involved in citizen science, people who want to be involved in discovering new galaxies because they've been drawn into that discussion by the astronomers. Huge interest in that. At the same time, we have a significant proportion of society that has a fundamental distrust of science and of conventional Western medicine, I should say. I don't mean traditional Chinese medicine, for example. I mean traditional Western medicine. We have there's this sort of tension between different views that come from our access to uncurated information. And so I think for all of us who are involved in science, it's really important that we promote the importance of evidence, that we explain what high quality evidence looks like. It's different from opinion, and try to promote the idea that there is a rational way to approach the problems that we face as society.
And what about all the participants in clinical trials? Do we do enough to reach? So these are people who are halfway across over the line. They're prepared to donate their time, whatever, to a clinical trial. And I know in the NHMRC national statement there is a requirement that you tell them about how the results of the research, but only it just needs to be mentioned on a website somewhere. There's no need to actually go and make sure that the people who participate are, they're tracked and kept up to date in a very nuanced fashion with what that piece of research showed. Is that a potential touch point where we could more involve people in the medical research sector? Are there ways we could be more creative about?
Yes, I can't comment on how effectively clinical trialists are communicating their data back to the participants in the trials, but I think Australia is getting better and doing a lot of work on advertising what opportunities there are to be involved in clinical trials, and being much more open about data through publication and other processes. So I think there's a lot of attention being paid to that at the moment. It's incredibly important for doing good quality medical research to have plenty of patients who are willing to participate in trials. And it's as you say, it's a very important point of engagement with the patient population.
And what about the Medical Research Future Fund? Is this going to tip the balance? Are we at have we reached rock bottom? And then, to address Lois's point, are we on the way up again? Does anybody have a sense? Are we out of the woods now?
If you talk to, I don't think scientists will ever be out of the woods somehow. there's always another experiment to do, and they're getting more and more expensive to do, and the kit's getting more and more expensive. But I think the MRFF is a fantastic opportunity. It doubles the amount of funding going into medical research in the country. So you're right. That is a fantastic step forward that has taken place. We're in the transition at the moment. It won't be till 2020, 2021 when it's reached full maturity. But by that point, then there's a lot of questions around what that's going to be, how that will be spent, who will decide how it gets spent, and those sort of issues, which I think will mature as the conversation evolves. But it certainly does provide a good opportunity to allow the clinical health delivery research to be focused around one fund and maybe translate discovery to translation in another in the NHMRC. So I think there's lots of opportunities there, and there'll be lots of discussion to be had around it. But it will double in the next 5 years. That's fantastic.
Can I? Yeah. Absolutely. I think that the Medical Research Future Fund, I think we all should be incredibly grateful for it. I think it's a tremendous initiative, but I guess my take on it is probably a little different, and I guess it comes back to what John was saying before about, you know, the pipeline and how much emphasis do we put on basic and translational research. And the way I guess I view it, and the Australian Society for Medical Research views it, is that funding and basic research, if you like, that are funded through the NHMRC is very much the foundations of the health and medical research and all the gains that we've made since the start of time, 75 plus years. So we liken the NHMRC, if you like, and the funding in the medical research endowment account very much as the first story of the house, and the way we view the Medical Research Future Fund is the second story. Now, the second story is not viable without solid foundations, okay? And that's what we are very concerned about, is the solid foundations in terms of the basic research particularly, because you need to keep seeding the ideas for the whole of the translational pipeline. So yes, I think in Australia we definitely do need a balance between basic and the end, the translational and the implementation research in order for the patients to get the benefits. But let's not forget the foundations and how we keep seeding every single point. And just also, even at the very, very end where the translational research is going, we still need basic research being popped in there too, around the basic research around implementing that particular end user product. So I think the basic research is really important, and we see at least the investment in NHMRC as critical as the first story of that house. Thanks, Sarah.
Hi, my name's Mark Sleeman, and I've had I come from an industry background, and I've come back to Australia and joined Monash University. I would just like to echo perhaps Darren's comments that this is an incredibly exciting time. There is a bit of pessimism going around, but I think people have to understand that drug development is for the long course. There's not going to be any quick turnaround here. We're not going to have breakthroughs. This is a long-term strategy. And I think we're investing in the future. Let's not be doom and gloom about this. We're on the right course. We have to deliver the right message to people and the public and support our basic researchers as well, fill that pipeline. I think we've got good strategy, good people in place. So let's not be all doom and gloom. We're on a great future, and it's a great time to do science.
Can I just ask you, how do you see us delivering, because we often talk about delivering the message to the public, but then we don't get into the details of how we're going to do that. So how would you see us doing that? Like, where are the touch points where and things I'm thinking about, things like the James Lind Alliance in the UK, where patients and carers are actually brought in to help decide how certain bits of funding are divvied out and, you know, what the priorities will be. So is there any appetite here for that sort of thing, to really start getting the public involved? Because we keep them a bit of hand's length at the moment.
Yes, but I think I don't have a magic answer or a magic bullet for that, but I think what you painted with the astrologers, I think, is a very good lesson that we have to do. We have to...
Astronomers.
Astronomers, sorry. Astronomers.
The astrologers are good as well.
Yes, sorry. The astronomers is...
And you're in good company, because nature got that wrong once. So.
But I think we just have to have a consistent message and do this. I think we'll bring the public along. We don't need any special program. I think but our sound bites have to be longer than just these small ones. We have to talk about the future and engagement in the long term, about therapeutics. You're right, Australia is seen as a great destination for medical research, for clinical trials, for innovative science. We have to speak more about it, showcase our young people, give our young people opportunities, and our public will come along and be, I think, all embracing.
Thank you. Gus.
I'll recount a very recent episode which I think addresses this concern. We had a lot of newspaper publicity the other day about a drug called venetoclax, which just happens to be a powerful anti-leukemic compound coming out of basic research. And the publicity surrounded the fact that the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute decided to monetize the future royalty flow and got $400 million in cold, hard cash to put into the endowment, with certain milestones having met, but in round figures, $400 million. Not a bad sum of money by anybody's telling. Now, the history of this thing is absolutely clear-cut. The fundamental discovery was made by David Vaux in Jerry Adams and Sue Corey's laboratory, PhD student, because they get a lot of the credit too. 30 years ago, discovered that a gene called BCL2, the product of that gene, stops cells from dying. And to cut a long story short, if you inappropriately stop cells from dying, it can be carcinogenic. And of course, there were multitudinous steps along the way in the 30 years to the actual drug, which in point of fact depended, in its turn, you mentioned the synchrotron, depended on very, very refined science defining a drug that stopped the interaction between two proteins. But let's forget about the details. The history was clear. And in the event, the Dean of Medicine approached me, the new Dean of Medicine, Kshitij Kapoor, with a very good idea. He said, you know, the history of this should be properly written up. And he said, why don't you let me go ahead and find a young PhD student from the university, a history student, who could tell that whole story from beginning to end. Now, I haven't had a chance yet to get back to Jerry and Suzanne, but I think that's a crackerjack idea, because it would make, first of all, a wonderful PhD thesis, secondly, a really good story. The story can be told over and over again. You know, this 12 years business that many of us have in our mind from discovery to drug, it's too short. The real story, we go right back to the beginning of the fundamental discovery that led to a chain of events, is usually much longer. By the way, it's worth noting in this room that Peter Coleman, who is the chief of the unit where the venetoclax drug was made, is actually responsible for two major drugs. The anti-influenza remedy Relenza is also Peter Coleman. And I'm not going to scare you very much, but I once drew a bead on the beginnings of Relenza. Where did Relenza really come from? And it came from Alfred Gottschalk, who worked for Mac Burnett on the enzymes of the influenza virus, and that was a 50-year story. I find that bow a little harder to draw, because there's a little bit of fudging that goes around here, but the chain of discovery is very long. But is it amazing that Peter Coleman's got two big drugs to his name? That doesn't happen very often.
Thank you, Gus. And that money is being reinvested in, I've just read the news reports, I should say, but it's going in to support early career researchers who are, they're competitive, isn't it?
In point of fact, the bulk of it is going into what you call the endowment of the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. And in response to your credo cur, I want to say the institutional basis of medical research is very important. And if you have a place like the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute, with its annual recurrent budget of about $110 million a year, it's a fairly sizable budget, that's only made possible because you have funding flows from just about everywhere. Federal government, state government, philanthropy, industry, income from the endowment, take it from wherever you can, pool it, and you've got then a bit of a buffer. Because if you lose your NHMRC grant and the director of the Hall Institute, Doug Hilton, thinks your work is crackerjack, he'll figure out a way to tap that, let's call it reserve fund, and he'll bootstrap you some way till you can bounce back and go to NHMRC again. I think the institutional underpinning of much of our medical research in this country is too tenuous. with solo researchers in a small university department trying to do it all on their own. And then, of course, if you lose your NHMRC grant, you fall flat on your face. Now, I'm not suggesting that the whole thing should be a whole series of Walter and Eliza Hall Institutes, but there's room for some thought here.
Thank you, Gus.
Hi, I'm Felix Kraus. I'm a PhD student at the Monash BDI. And I have a question raised on the point from Sarah Meachem and Darren Kelly. And so in the last 3 years, there was a massive push from the universities to restructure the PhD programs, to make it more, to the PhD students learn soft skills, which could be good for their employment in industry, but also to shorten the PhD program and to streamline it a bit. But then, on the other hand, this means that the supervisors in the lab lose actually valuable research time from their research students in their PhD, especially like in the 3rd and 4th year. And I wanted to ask you, or the panel, because all of you are either in industry or as group leaders, how do you see the future of the PhD once as in one light as a degree, and on the other hand, my question is more, when PhD students have to be more streamlined, they obviously can research less, and what's the impact on the quality of the PhD as a qualification for hiring, but also on the universities as a whole regarding to international competition?
Can I just follow? So are you implying that because you have to do those other subjects, the quality of the PhD for the student is less?
The output is less if you have 3 years instead of 3 or 4 or 5.
So you do less research, but are you a better researcher? So the two are not necessarily the same.
Well, I think you can learn more in 5 years than in 3 years. And obviously the value of a PhD for your supervisor as you as a student is higher if you have a longer PhD, because you can do more stuff in the work, especially if you want to go onto a postdoc, for example.
Thank you.
I think it's a choice. I mean, if you want to spend 3 or 3.5 years just doing research and that's your thing, then go for it. But if you want to learn other skills, you want to learn broader skills, it doesn't have to be enterprise, it could be chemistry, it could be engineering, how to code computers, then that should be up to the choice of the student as well. So I think, and the supervisors. So I think there's a mix, and I don't think there's an absolute answer. It's your choice.
Could there be a better way in terms of serving society, though? Because it's sort of, it's taxpayers' money, so what would end up with the best research? Enterprise students that are broader and, have a broader skill set, or students that just...
I still think there's a balance between, you've got some students that are highly innovative and probably best spent their time in the lab, and others that are more entrepreneurial, so I think there's a bit of a mix.
And I'd hope that the programs that are being put in place for that training period, which is supposed to develop more broad skills, really does support different researchers with different or different PhD students with different interests. Those that there's more research focused things to be doing, but also being able to understand how the commercialization process works, understand how to do some entrepreneurial training. These are things that I think are pretty fundamental to a lot of research these days, and getting those basic skills is really critical for a really balanced portfolio. We know that PhD students we train many more PhD students than there are academic positions and research fellowships in the country. I'm perfectly comfortable with that. I think the more scientifically trained people we have out working in government, working in industry, working in the commercial sector, I think that is going to lead to a much better society. It's going to lead to a lot more evidence-based decision making instead of internet-based decision making. So I think I would love for our PhD students to be able to go out there, do the training that they really see valuable to them during the course of their 4-year PhD, which is what we really aiming to go for here, and be able to then take those skills either into the research sector if they go into research and postdocing and developing a career, or into or into any other sector that they end up deciding to go into. I think it's an exciting time, and I think it is important to be able to get those skills honed, and I hope that's the message.
It's also what Anne was talking about earlier on about when you're peer reviewing grant applications, you do need experience from other. Just being a discovery researcher is not enough if you're judging peers who may be innovating. Sorry, Sarah.
Yeah, I'm just sort of reflecting on, your question or your statements, and I also think it's yes, absolutely. It's about diversifying your skills and experiences, but I think there's a bit of a gap also. I have an enormous number of people coming and talking to me about what transferable skills that the post-PhD person has. I've pretty much seen my career has gone from pipette to policy, so I do a lot of policy stuff now. And I've had a boutique media business as well. So I've really, but where did those skills come from? I didn't have a degree in anything else that I've done in policy or communication or journalism. I actually got it from my PhD. And I think what's missing in the narrative, and I guess, John, maybe even at the university level, is having those conversations with PhD students about, it's not just about the cell that you're looking at and what you found in your PhDs, but what are the skills? And I think there's so many transferable skills. And people ask me, what is a PhD good for? I say a PhD is good for everything. Maybe you're not going to get a job in Coles stacking those apples anymore, okay? But that's okay. There's just, and critical thought, I think, is the key thing that one gets from having a PhD. And I think that increases your employability hugely. So that's my take on what your question was.
And
I'll leap in very quickly here and say that having had the good fortune of supervising many PhD students over rather too long a time, some would say an altogether too long time, it's wonderful to have these PhD students come back 10, 15, 20 years later and say, oh, I'm now working in government. Oh, I'm now working as a school teacher. Oh, now I'm working as a patent attorney. But those 3.5 years of PhD at the Walton Hall Institute were the best years of my life, and I wouldn't exchange them for anything. Of course, they're not all going to get jobs in academia. There's far too many students for them to all get jobs in academia. But if you learn to think, and by the way, don't forget the freedom to have 3.5 years where pretty much you determine your agenda every day of the week. It's magic. And so you learn to think and you broaden that skill base. It's got to be about more than just the detailed day-to-day experiments.
Thank you, Gus. Was there somebody else? Anne, did you?
I was just going to say a PhD is really a degree in problem solving.
Yes.
And it can apply to anything. So if you can't answer the question, what problem are you trying to solve, then you're probably collecting stamps.
We've got somebody else creeping up here? Yeah?
This gentleman's been waiting for a while.
Please.
Well, it's to follow up on several of the points you've made. With respect to the low morale amongst my young colleagues, I think it is a serious problem, and I think we're not really understanding how this has come about. And I speak from decades of research. I'm not, by the way, I should start by saying I'm all in favour of more money for research. Last year was the first time in my career since 1969, which I started at University College London, when my group's not had a grant. So it is a serious problem, but the question is, why are things out of sync? It's not just a matter of there not being enough money coming from government. We could all ask for more. Don't forget the United States, NIH doubled its budget 15 years ago, from which my group benefited, but by a very large RO1, which on a scale we'd never have got from NHMRC. And yet the American scientists are all complaining they don't have enough money. And in my view, in a sense, it is the fault of my generation and several generations behind me because of the model in which we run our research. The model is the guy at the top, the group leader, or whatever you want to call him, and an army of people underneath who at least until recently have been brought up with the idea that they can all become a general. And it doesn't work like that. I mean, I saw the same for the brief time I was in medicine in the UK. You know, it was a pyramid with a consultant at the top and all the slaves underneath running it, all brought up in the view they could eventually become God. And again, it doesn't work like that. So I think people are talking about stepping back. I think we need to step back and look at the model which is functioning at the moment of the general and the slaves all brought up with the idea they can one day become a general. And one of the big things which is missing in that is actually experience, because with the 3-year grant cycle that people are talking about, you take people on, you get them trained up. It's much harder to get experienced postdocs and senior research fellows employed in your lab. I'm really lucky, I've got 2 who've been with me for decades, but getting them funding is a nightmare. And I see it on GRPs, the grant panels, where everybody's trying to push the budget down and they'll argue, oh, well, you don't really need a grade 4, a grade 3 or a grade 2 will do. And that is getting experience out of the system. So I think the model needs to be looked at, and it would be much more effective in terms of delivering good research to have more middle career people who don't necessarily have an aspiration to become the general, but are providing a huge level of experience. I suspect one of the reasons, especially in bigger labs, that there are now emerging stories of poor quality research or even fraudulent research is simply some of these groups are too big and they don't have enough experience, so there's nobody there to watch what's going on. And I think that's a particular problem in the States, but I suspect it could be here. So my push would be to have a look at that model and see whether there isn't some way of persuading universities to rebuild it with some help from NHMRC.
Thank you. Anne, is the restructuring of the grants, is that going to address, because I know the grants are going to get longer, there's grants for ideas, is that going to address the pyramid scheme?
Well, I think we are very deliberately shaking things up a bit with the new grant program, which will start from 2020, funding from 2020. And it's significantly different from the current system in a number of ways, but it's still, of course, it's built on the structure of our whole national system. So I think it's difficult for one funding agency to totally change the balance of what you describe. But we are, in the new funding system, wanting to give much more emphasis and freedom to up-and-coming researchers and to reduce the drivers for everybody to put in a grant that has the most senior person with the most developed track record on as the key person on every application from that group. I think that the way the system has been working as it became more and more competitive is that it has driven people to do exactly that. And so it's reinforced the kind of pyramidal model that you describe, and it's made it much harder for the emerging researcher to get their bit of sunlight, to get the funding they need to show their independence. So we'll see how the new system works. It is a significant change. It will change the balance of funding around the country, and its intentions are in part to give more opportunities to those young people coming through. There's an important component of it as well, which is the so-called Ideas Grant Scheme, which is meant to give opportunities to people who don't have such well-developed track records and really is designed to be an opportunity for the emerging researcher, the person who doesn't have a huge track record but may nevertheless have brilliant ideas and be able to put up a really fantastic project. At the moment, it will be very hard for such a person with a group of collaborators to get that grant, except by having the senior person who's got the huge track record on their grant with them. So we are trying to disrupt that pattern. Whether it's successful in the way that you'd like to see, I don't know. We'll see how that evolves over the first 2 to 5 years.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment? Or we have another.
Thank you very much. I'm Fabio Turati, the Chief Operating Officer for the Synthesis Group of companies. And first of all, before asking the question, I just wanted to say I was completely blown away by the number of young PhD students present here tonight. I think if you wanted a measure of the passion that this industry drives, I mean, here it is here. The panel, or the audience and the panel has talked about the importance of both the amount and the continuity of capital invested in research. But I think equally important, as Sarah has mentioned earlier, is the continuity of career. So a panel here in front of us as leaders in the industry and their network, what are the top 5 things that you see that need to be implemented to build that continuity of career, allowing scientists to move away from academia into industry and then back into academia? Because as you said, they are knowledgeable, they have the skill sets to bridge all of those. So what are the top 5 things that you think the panel thinks, and as their networks think, need to be implemented to allow that to happen? And how do we, as an industry, as a country, allow these top 5 things to occur?
Sarah?
I could talk about that for hours. But let me just go back to probably not what you're expecting, but something I'm really passionate about, and I think what's really important and I guess personal as well, is that I wouldn't have got where I was today without mentors. And in terms of career and career development, if you don't have that somebody or those somebodies in order to be able to talk or see something in you that maybe you don't see even in yourself, to have that person or persons, I think mentoring is invaluable. And I suspect even the highest leaders in this country and even people like the people on this panel here probably all have mentors, whether they're formal or informal, whether they can actually say they're mentors or not. I think mentors, given that you were alluding to all the PhD students, is really critical for career development.
Yep, I'd agree with that, 100%.
We do choose them well, though.
Hello, I'm just a student studying a Bachelor of Engineering, but I actually have a question. Yes, baby little me. I actually have a question about why Australia became such a powerhouse for the biomedical industry. I want to know why, despite the higher cost of labour in Australia, despite the fact that our very near neighbours have much lower costs of employment, much lower minimum wages. They can get away with a lot more through legislation. They might be able to fast track their products through their own version of an FDA, which may not be as stringent. Why, despite that, why Australia is thriving, what our advantages are. Is it our quality management? Is it our regulations? Is it the law? Is it the sheer size of the sector in Australia? Or the network and the people? What is it that drives us, and how can we leverage it to improve the sector?
That is a fabulous question. Gus?
I'll just give you one answer. Of course, it's only a very partial answer. But, you know, research is unbelievably traditional. And so I think the fact that people like Mac Burnett, Jack Eccles, Frank Fenner, the greats of the past, set up labs and set up an institutional framework is hugely important because excellence begets excellence. If you have someone like Mac Burnett, a charismatic figure known throughout the world, Nobel Prize and all the rest of it, the best will naturally be attracted, like bees to a honeypot, and they in their turn will attract best PhD students and so forth. So I know it's only a very partial answer, but I think it's very important.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. Anyone else have anything to contribute?
It's my job.
No, I'm in charge now.
Go for it.
That's a very good point, and the university sector in Australia is built on really strong foundations that came from Europe many years ago. The culture of research, the culture of academia has been continued since for hundreds of years, and it really was transplanted to Australia by our men and women who came before, and they've set up that culture, and it's really propagated over the last couple of hundred years into something that is now really a very robust situation. But I'd be very, very, very concerned about thinking our near neighbours were not as competitive. They've been, if we look at research and biomedical research in China, and we look at the growth that has undertaken there in the last 10 years, in 10 years, and you look at where they're going to be in 100 years, if it keeps going at the rate it's going, then we will look like relatively small producers. We'll still be very high quality bespoke researchers, but there'll be a very big activity happening up north. And I think this is one of the, it was mentioned earlier. I think, Sarah, that was a brilliant idea. Setting up a regional funding agency equivalent to the EU framework would be a really exciting possibility in this sector. So we do need ways to be able to work with our near neighbours. I spent most of my career in Europe, and the first couple of years I did a lot of back and forth to Europe, which was devastating just because of the jet lag. Moving, now working with Asia a lot more, going to China, going to Japan, going to these other new research powerhouses is a real opportunity for Australian research to continue to grow and collaborate, I think. So I think it's a really important
Maybe
point.
the jet lag has helped. Maybe those sleepless hours.
Yeah.
We've got time for one more question. So,
good evening. Thank you for the panel. Very high profile today. And I take the lead of my fellow engineer. I'm also an engineer, and my area of expertise is simulations, numerical simulations and virtual simulations. There's a broad application. I think Monash is one of the biggest universities investing in simulation in Australia. And also knowing a little bit about business, I see a lot of the problem being the high costs of experimental testing in biomedical. And more money is always a good solution, of course, but would be cut off costs the other side of the solution maybe? And maybe do you believe that it's a challenge to bring more technology and simulation and software into the testing of drug delivery or I don't know, high frequency electromagnetics and all these fields that we well aware that can be developed through simulations, to bring the technology into the traditional research that it's incredibly valuable and will take several years to do, but maybe shorten the time and reducing the costs. So my question is mainly towards
So are we missing an opportunity there by not doing the simulations?
I mean, the biggest area, the hottest area at the moment, and it's a Boston review, is artificial intelligence and big data. So they're the hot areas around the world, and we should be doing more of that. And going back to that economic debate, which I might try and answer as well from the previous question, we've been fantastic. We're a very wealthy country, and we've spent a lot of time digging holes and making money out of it. And now we need to translate that into knowledge so that we can build up science in Australia. And in many ways, the digging the holes part of the equation needs to go back into society for some incentive in terms of building up that knowledge economy.
I'm all for the AI and for the best use of IT that you can possibly imagine, but I think it's also crucially important to have the best and the most up-to-date equipment for the research that you're going to pursue. We often forget it's damn competitive out there, and there's not much joy in being the second person to discover something. So if that other guy in Japan has a synchrotron and you don't, and it's crucial for the particular work, forget it. You can be as clever as you like and have as much IT as you like. So I'm a firm believer in absolute state-of-the-art equipment, consumable supplies. If you're going to support research, support it properly. No use being second-guessed because you'll lose the race.
Any other comments? John?
Thanks for the plug for Monash there. I think it is. I think the opportunities around bringing IT, bringing engineering into the biomedical sector is enormous, and the medical sector more broadly is enormous. A great example. One of our best papers from last year came out of a collaboration between a lab who worked on simulating forces in cells and working out how those forces were involved in determining which part of an embryo was going to become the embryo and which part was going to become the extra embryonic tissues. And the insights that the modelling and the simulations had really directed the research that they're able to test experimentally. And I think that's something we really want to, we're really in a great position with, really strong IT and really strong engineers right next door, we're able to really harness and make the most of. And then into medical engineering, into the sort of more, into the sector you're talking about there is, the possibilities there linking up with clinicians, with people in the clinics, understanding what the problems in delivery is and bringing the best IT solutions to that is also another huge area of research that's going on at the moment around the world. So I think it's an exciting time in that area, and it's an interesting one because it's funding it can be a little bit challenging as well because there's not a lot of people who are expert in that area, and if you send it to if things get reviewed by engineers or modelers, maybe it's not doing quite what they expect, and it's not quite what the biologists can understand either. So it's an interesting conundrum in how best to support that really, highly creative and highly collaborative interdisciplinary research.
You've got to put them together to work in the same place, which is the challenge, right?
Yeah, it's good.
Right,
now we will have to start wrapping up. So could I just ask the panelists if you could just perhaps summarise in as few words as possible what the main take-home message has been for you tonight? And it may be, the challenge you came with, but you may have found that there's something that you picked up from the audience or from the discussion. So what do you think the take-home messages are? And John, can I start with you? Is that okay? Sorry to not give you much time to...
Yeah, okay. So I will say discovery research is done by outstanding scientists, and there's many great scientists in the audience, and I think getting career pathways sorted out for those is absolutely important. But I did like the fact that there is a very positive aspect about research and the environment that we've currently got for translating research. And I think it's a very important thing to remember that, we do talk about funding, we do struggle with funding on a day-to-day basis, but we do what we love doing, and it's a privilege to do it, but we've got to make sure we get it through to commercialisation industry as quickly as possible as well.
Thank you. Anne?
I think it's an incredibly exciting time for health and medical research because of what's available to us today through research, and also because we have very strong government support for it, and yet we feel demoralised and depressed about some aspects of it. So I think it is time to think about the structure of our systems. It is time to make sure we're looking after the next generation, because the opportunities are there. It's a rough little time, I think. I hope a short time that we're going through, but I'm very optimistic for the future.
Thank you.
I'd say we need to work on our knowledge economy and build that human resources pipeline.
Thank you. Sarah?
Probably just echo what Anne said. I think that it is a really incredibly exciting time, and just because there's a lot of challenges doesn't actually necessarily mean it's negative. I think we're sitting, and I think we've sat for a long time on a golden egg here, but I actually think if we are very mindful about it, that golden egg can bring even something more delightful to Australia and the world, I guess.
Thank you. Gus?
To me, I was thrilled about the buzz surrounding the young people. All these eager PhD students, they haven't asked too many questions, but they're there and they're breasting the waves and they're having a struggle, and they're not going to let any of these impedances disturb them. They're just going to go ahead and do it, and that is the hope for Australia, and indeed it's the hope for the world. I think second to that, I've been convinced by the discussion that has flowed back and forth that this whole question of pure versus applied is all a question of balance. Like most things in human affairs, it's not black and white. And yes, I very much appreciate the cri de coeur. Let's not forget the basic research. Of course, it's the crucible, it's the fons et origo of the whole business. But we've got to struggle for a continuity, a continuum here, and that balance is going to be quite difficult to achieve, but worthwhile trying.
Thank you, Gus. Now, if we could can I just let you know about the next event, or a future event, and that's the Graham Clark Oration, and that is with Harold Varmus is coming over from the States to talk about transitions in cancer research. That would be one not to miss. And if we could have the next slide. And I have to mention the sponsors. So all organisations support the Convergence Science Network, and the Convergence Science is about bringing, integrating science, and speaks to our last question really about the idea of making sure that you bring engineers and biomedical and clinicians and get them all together, because the societal problems are multidisciplinary and our approach has to be. So these are all the people who champion that approach. So the end of the formal proceedings, so we just have a round of applause for, first of all, our wonderful panellists. It's been fantastic listening to you. And then also to you, the audience, for asking your questions and sharing your ideas, which has also been absolutely invaluable. Thank you very much.